powered by Lupin Pharmaceuticals in association with Higher Secondary Principals Forum.
Dear students, this is a wonderful gesture of Prudent Media for the cause of the students of Goa. I'm very grateful to Prudent Media and Principal Forum for presenting me before you. Dear student, today we are going to deal with the second chapter of political science, and that is end of bipolarity. Now, before starting with the end of bipolarity, student, I would like to take you back to the very first topic what already you may have dealt with. And the first topic what you have studied, because this is the base of the second chapter, that is end of bipolarity. And I would just like to take certainly some few glimpses of the Cold War we would like to see today. Now certainly this Cold War, you know, it was an ideological battle between the two great superpowers which emerged after the end of the Second World War. And these two great powers, certainly one was USA with its ideology, capitalism, and democracy, and the second one, second one was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, that is USSR, with its own ideology, that was communism and socialism. Now, when we go through that, we have studied after the Second World War, there was actually a race between the two superpowers to form an alliances, military alliances. And certainly, the Western Alliance, namely NATO, which was formed by the United States of America, and the other pact which was formed, the military pact, was the Warsaw Pact. Later on, you may have just gone through that why both the superpower was so much distrustful of each other. And if you go through that, you'll understand why it was so. The America, which was a democracy in nature, there was totally a free elections. No, on to the other hand, in the Soviet Union, there was no election at all. Then the second difference, democracy in the US capitalism, then autocratic and dictatorship, capitalist against communist, survival of the fittest, which is the main motto of the capitalist society and the democratic societies. And on to the other hand, the communist, what we have here, everybody helps everybody. Next, when you talk about the capitalism and democracy of the America, one of the richest world power, and on to the other hand, you have the USSR, which is a very, very poor economic base. Then we also talk about, when we talk about the democracy, we have all that is the personal freedom for the individuals. And later on, when you come to the Soviet side, you will see the society controlled by the secret police. And above all, the democracy, there was so much freedom which was given, freedom to media, and there was a total censorship in the communist regime. Now, when you were dealing with this very first topic, Cold War, you may have also seen that the whole world was divided into three different groups. The first world, which was of the US and its allies countries with the democracy and capitalism. Second world, that is of the USSR and the countries within the Soviet bloc. And the third, certainly, that was the least developed countries or developing countries, which has formed the third group, was called as a non-aligned countries. Then we talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis here. You already have studied the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in this Cuban Missile Crisis, you may have also studied these prominent leaders. First, of course, Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Russia, then John F. Kennedy of USA, and then, of course, the military general of the Cuba, Fidel Castro. Then also, as I've said, there was a non-aligned movement which played a prominent role during this particular phase. And the prominent role which was played by the non-aligned movement was that it did not allow this Cold War to turn into a hot war. And that was the major role played. And I'm proud to say this movement, which was led by our country, that is India. Within this chapter, the previous Cold War, you have also studied about the new international economic order, and more particularly the LDCs, that was to accelerate the economic growth and development of these LDCs. Now we are coming to the main topic of today's discussion, and that is end of bipolarity. Dear students, just look at the world after 1945. When we looked at that particular world of 1945, after 1945, we saw the emergence of two superpowers. Now, these two superpowers, and after 1945, that resulted what is called as Cold War between these two superpowers. And suddenly, and when we talk about the Cold War, it was the ideological differences between two. It was an ideological conflict between the two. Both were trying to tell the world, look, I'm the best, be the part of my alliances. That is what was being done during this particular phase. So many countries supported USA with its ideology of capitalism and democracy, while some countries supported the ideology of the Soviet Russia, communism and socialism. But the big question before us, that what may have happened wrong? Why this Soviet Russia collapsed in 1991? Let us first start with what actually was a Soviet Union. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, that is USSR, was constitutionally a socialist state that existed in Eurasia from 1922 to 1991. The common short name is Soviet Union. Now look at these 15 countries. This total 15 countries together form what is called as the Soviet Union. You can just go through this particular 15, these countries came together and formed what is called as the Soviet Union. This is the map of all those countries which came together. This was the Soviet Union of that time. This was the flag which was adopted by the Soviet Union, and of course, that symbol of the hammer and sickle. The hammer and the sickle symbolize nations, workers, and that of the peasants, and certainly the star speaks about the regime or the rule of that communist party. Now we are coming to the first very idea. What was the Soviet system? Now this Soviet system, which was set up after 1917, that took a what is called as there was a revolution, Russian Revolution in 1917, and after execution of the ruler there, this system was installed or brought in Russia, Soviet Russia. Now what was the total Soviet Russia was like? The Soviet political system concentrated around the Communist Party. In Soviet Russia, there was only one political party, and every activities was concentrating or concentrated around this Communist Party of the Soviet Russia. The economy was totally planned and controlled by the state. There was no other any competitor. There was no private property, nothing of that sort. Every economic activity was planned and was totally controlled by the state. The Soviet Union, which was existing then, had a complex communication network, vast energy resources, including oil, iron, steel, machinery production, etc. The basic necessities of the life like health, education, and other welfare activities were looked by the state alone. Because the means of production, distribution, everything was controlled by the state. And therefore, it was a responsibility of the Soviet state to take care of the people, including the education, child care, health care. Everything was freely given by the state to the people. Land and all the other productive assets, including big industries also, everything was being controlled. All the means of production, distribution was totally controlled by the state alone. However, this Soviet system became more bureaucratic in nature and authoritarian, making life difficult for the people. Citizens were denied freedom of speech, and one-party system represented by the Communist Party, that is of the Soviet Union, had a very light control over institution and was unaccountable for the people. Now, this was the Soviet system. Dear student, however, we have done this Soviet system, but often the very less opportunity that question may appear on this particular part of the Soviet system. Because I wanted to go to the next questions, we need to understand what was the Soviet system. This Soviet system, which existed then in Soviet Russia from 1917 onwards, continued till 1991, almost more than 70 years, this same system prevailed in the Soviet Russia. Now you yourself will know, when we sit up with the same thing continuously for the years together, life becomes very dull and difficult. And maybe because, and there's only one political party, there are no opposition, there are no other parties can emerge in the system. And when the no parties can emerge in the system, naturally, one or the other day, there was a time to come that this Soviet Russia would have disintegrated. And certainly, in this particular topic, we are dealing with the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. Now, dear student, this will be the first type of a question which will come for the exam, in the board exam particularly, and that is altogether, this particular chapter may have around about 5 marks for you in the final exam, and one question of the 4 marks very often comes on this particular chapter. The first very important question which can come in the board exam for the final exam, or for the 4 marks, and that is the causes responsible for the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. The very first cause responsible for the disintegration of the Soviet Russia is the internal weaknesses of Soviet political and economic institutions. Now, dear student, let me tell you, this Soviet Russia, which was set up in 1917, was taking a care of every citizen from the point of view of from the education, healthcare, childcare, everything was looked after by the state. But dear student, from 1917, by the time they come till 1991, till the disintegration is too big span of time. That is more than 70 years. And certainly, later on, the people have developed high aspiration towards this particular system because they were getting everything what they wanted. But slowly and steadily, we have seen that this political institution and the economic institution, which was nearly working for the people, slowly and steadily, they failed to meet the aspirations of the people of Soviet Russia. And because they could not deliver the way they were doing it in the beginning of the era, starting of this particular system, the people was unable, they were finding it difficult there, to match up with this particular system. And this, to meet these aspirations of the people, it was not in the capacity of the state now, and hence, it was one of the cause which was responsible for the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. And this particularly led to the economic stagnation. And this economic stagnation was responsible for the severe consumer shortage. The people were not getting the basic necessities like, the daily requirements was not fulfilled by the state. And certainly, this was the first cause for the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. That is the internal weaknesses of the Soviet political and economic institution. The second cause which was responsible for the disintegration of the Soviet Russia was the development of the satellite states. Now, what we mean by the development of the satellite state? Dear student, in the very first topic you have studied about the Warsaw Pact. The Soviet Russia went on making friends, and that military alliance was formed, what is called as a Warsaw Pact. Now, when you are the biggest power in that, the Soviet Russia, naturally Soviet Russia required to take care of all the satellite states. Much of the resources, money was spent by the Soviet Russia in developing nuclear and military arsenals of the satellite state, those friend countries of the Soviet Russia. So at that cost, naturally, they neglected the domestic things. At home, what was the requirements of the people was not fulfilled, but the Soviet state was much interested, to fulfill the needs of the satellite state. And this was the second cause responsible for the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. Thirdly, Communist Party was not accountable for the people. 70 years, more than 70 years ruling one single political party. We can't tolerate it, one single party ruling for 5 years also. There are midterm elections which are sometime held. And 70 years, one single party ruling, more than 70 years, one single party. And that too, it was more autocratic in nature, authoritarian in nature, was not accountable to the people. Today, immediately, if the government is doing something wrong, we, the people, are asking, putting a question in front of the government. So why these are things like this? And immediately the government needed to answer us. But in this particular system, the Communist Party of the Soviet Russia was not at all accountable to the people. And this, because of this, the ordinary people felt alienated from this particular system. They felt they are very stranger in this particular system. Nobody of us, the government is not responsible. We are trying to ask some question to the government and the government is not giving any answer. So this Communist Party which was there in the Soviet Russia for 70 years was not accountable to the people. And that was the third cause or the reason why the Soviet Russia disintegrated. Fourthly, the party bureaucrats gained more privileges. Now, living in the same system, the bureaucrats which were there, the party workers who are there, they knew now everything about this particular system. Slowly and steadily, all the privileges, all the concession, all the benefits was being enjoyed by this bureaucrat. And at the cost, the poor masses, the people of the Soviet Russia was not getting what they were supposed to get it from the government. And therefore, the government of the Soviet Russia lost the popular backing of the people. When the system started in 1970, there was a big support of the people for this particular system. But as the thing changes, we have also seen after 1945 forming an alliances, Soviet Russia working for their friend countries, I mean the satellite countries, spending money on there for the economic and the military development of those particular satellite states. And at the cost here, the poor people, the people of Soviet Russia was neglected the basic things. And above all, this bureaucrats started enjoying more privileges, all concession, all the economic benefits was being enjoyed by these bureaucrats, and hence the people or the government lost the popular backing of the people. That was the fourth. And the fifth cause responsible was the citizen became aware of the development of the West. Being at home, the people from the Soviet Russia started looking at America, a country with the capitalist system, with a democratic form of government. People were enjoying all sort of a freedom. People were free to make money, for every activity was free. Every sort of a freedom was enjoyed there. And there was a vast development. Day by day, the people was looking at that America and was watching that how fast it has developed. And on to the other hand, the two superpowers which emerged in 1945, the America was far ahead economically, politically, and even when we talk about the hard power of America, they were very, very far better than that of the Soviet Russia. So this comparison, the citizen of Soviet Russia started comparing their system and that of the system which existed in the America. And that really was another cause responsible for the disintegration or collapse of the Soviet Russia. And certainly the last thing what he comes here is the Gorbachev's reform. In 1985, Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Russia. And dear friends, this Gorbachev was much attracted towards the ideology of America, that is of the capitalism, democracy. He brought so many political and the economic reforms and the democratization within Soviet Russia. So naturally, the leader himself, when he fell for the ideology of the America, naturally, it was very sure that at home also, this system which existed, that was a communism and socialism, was sure to collapse. And this reforms which was introduced by the Gorbachev, that is was Mikhail Gorbachev, lead the country, and it was complete disruption and disintegration of the Soviet Russia. Dear friends, dear student, these are the different causes which are responsible for the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. Now, when we go through these causes of the disintegration, student, you may be also referring some other books. You may be also going through the NAD, and you will get many other reasons also. Please have a word with your own teachers, whether to include those particular points. If you find any new points, when you do some particular references here and there, ask your teachers whether you could include those other points also, because we cannot get in all those particular points because of the short span of time. So these are the some of those points which you can put it for this particular answer for the disintegration. Once again, I'm going through that. That is the internal weaknesses of the Soviet political and economic institution. Second, development of the satellite state. Third, Communist Party was not accountable for the people. Fourth, party bureaucrats gained more privileges. Fifth, citizens became more aware of the development of West. And the last, certainly, Gorbachev's reform was the last which was responsible for the disintegration of the Soviet system. Now, here you can see the reforms which was introduced by the Mikhail Gorbachev, and here on your screen is the Gorbachev's image, who was maybe wholly responsible for the disintegration of the Soviet Russia because of his economic policies, his political and economic policy and democratization in the Soviet Russia. Dear student, now we are going for another question, consequence of disintegration of the Soviet Russia. The causes, after going through the causes, we'll just like to go through some of those consequences of disintegration of the Soviet Russia. What happened next to the Soviet Russia? Now, the existence of the Soviet Russia, 1917, it emerged as one big Soviet Russia. 1945, end of the Second World War, emergence of the two superpowers, one is the USA and other is the Soviet Russia. This Soviet Russia, more than 70 years, this system prevailed in the Soviet Russia. It started disintegrating. Various causes we have studied for the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. And now we are going to talk about the consequence of the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. The very first consequence was the end of the Cold War confrontation. We have seen this ideology, socialism, communism, completely was destroyed, collapsed. Now, the Cold War, which actually had happened because of the two different ideology, one of the America, that is capitalism and democracy, and the second of the Soviet Russia, that was a communism and socialism. Dear friends, with the collapse of the Soviet Russia, automatically the Cold War, which lasted nearly for 45 years, between the Soviet Russia and America came to an end. That mad race for armaments which was going on between the US and the USSR also stopped. And the question regarding who is the best, which ideology is the best, whether it is capitalism of America or whether it is a socialism of the Soviet Russia, was no more issue left now, because it was proved now that there's nothing better than that of the capitalism and democracy, and hence why still America have dominated in the world as the superpower. So naturally, the first consequence of the disintegration of the Soviet Russia was the end of Cold War confrontation. Automatically, on its own, that Cold War era was, stopped between this particular two superpower which was going on. It came to an end with the collapse of the Soviet Russia, or with the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. That is the first. Second, two options were open in the world now. Earlier, it was only the dominance of two superpowers, America on one side and naturally the Soviet Russia on the other side, with their respective allies. Now what has happened in the world was, the countries of the world, there was a discussion which was going on in the world, that there are two options open. One, either there will be a unipolar world in which the America will be still will emerge as a greatest superpower. And the second option available here was now that number of other countries may emerge or may come together, and the world can be a multipolar world. But unfortunately, the second thing did not happen. There was not a multipolar world, but after the collapse of the Soviet Russia in 1991, America started dominating in the world, and the world was only what is called as a unipolar world, where America started dominating in the world politics. Third, the emergence of new countries. Dear friends, in the very beginning I said the Soviet Russia which came into existence comprises of 15 small countries together. Here, after the disintegration of the Soviet Russia, there was this emergence of the new countries. They broke, they separated from the alliances of the Soviet Russia, and they now wanted to be an independent. Many of the eastern states wanted to join the European Union and become a part of the NATO. Look, this is much more interesting. Where earlier they was the part of the Soviet Russia, now they need to break up from there and be a part of the NATO. That was something great which was happening. So there was an emergence of the new countries with the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. And the last, of course, the emergence of the new players in the international system. There was only two great players which was all the way trying to play the politics of the world, and that was one was the USA and the other was the USSR. And no other country was in the limelight till then. Now with the collapse of the Soviet Russia, with the disintegration of the Soviet Russia, what we see is the emergence of the new players. Many new countries started coming up with their different identity, interest, and the political aspirations. So this was the consequence of the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. Once again, I'll just go through very fast the consequence of the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. Dear friend, the first very consequence was end of the Cold War confrontation. The Cold War specifically, which was an ideological conflict between the two superpowers, USA and USSR, automatically, because the Soviet Russia's ideology, socialism and communism, completely collapsed. So there was no way that the Cold War will continue. So naturally, it resulted into the end of the Cold War confrontation. Then the world was looking at maybe a two option. Either the world will be unipolar world where America will be dominating, or it can be a multipolar world also. But what we saw after that was the America started dominating in the world with what is called as a unipolar world. And naturally, there was an emergence of the new countries. New countries started coming up, and these new countries, though they were earlier the part of the Soviet alliance, they wanted to break from the Soviet alliance system and wanted to be a part of the NATO, which was a military alliance of the America. And of course, the emergence of the new players earlier, only it was the game of two players, that is USA and the USSR, and now we see there are a number of other countries wanted to play at the international level with their own different identity, with their different interests, and with their own aspirations. So dear student, after going through the two questions of the end of bipolarity, one is the causes for the disintegration of the Soviet Russia, and the second is consequence of the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. It is little clear in our mind that this Soviet Russia, which emerged in 1917 after the Soviet socialist revolution in Soviet Russia, continued till 1991, and it collapsed in 1991. Collapsed in the sense the ideology that was a socialism and communism no more existed now. This ideology was not liked by the people of the Soviet Russia, and it disintegrated. Now the question was, this disintegrated Soviet Russia which was there was a need to get in the life back, because the ideology is the lifeline of any particular country. If this ideology is lost, then naturally the country becomes lifeless. And now there was a need to get into the life back to this the countries which broke from the Soviet Russia and the other countries, the friend countries of the Soviet Russia. And therefore, the World Bank and International Monetary Fund came forward with one particular concept which is called as the shock therapy. So shock therapy was applied to those disintegrated countries of the Soviet Russia, including Russia and other allies of the Soviet Russia. Now, what is this shock therapy is? The first thing, shift to the capitalist economy. We have studied in the past what was the Soviet system, when it was socialism, communism, rule of one party, and where the means of production, distribution, which was controlled by the state, nothing owned by the private individuals. The first very thing what was required here is, and that shock therapy, which was designed by the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, said, you need to take now this shock therapy. And under this shock therapy, what you are supposed to do is that shift to the capitalist economy. No more that ideology of socialism. Give up that, and you need to shift to the capitalist economy. That means the private ownership was to be the pattern, dominant pattern in the society. The private ownership, everything, land, industries, everything should be privatized. No more state will look after all this particular means of production and distribution. The privatization. Second, privatization of the state assets. Every asset, including land, industry, everything, including farming, everything should be a capital. There should be a capitalism in farming also. This was the second. Third, FDI was to be the engines of change. That was the foreign direct investment. Till now, the foreign companies were not allowed to enter in the Soviet Russia. They don't allow the other companies to come, other countries of the world to come and invest in their own country. Here, under the shock therapy, it was specifically told to all those countries that what you need to do is that you need to open the door now for the foreign investor. The foreign investors will come, and more particularly all those Western countries, developed countries were waiting to invest. So you open your door, the foreign companies will come in those particular countries, disintegrated country, the countries which have already lost their particular ideology of socialism, communism. The FDIs will be the major engines of change. You open the door, allow the other countries, and more particularly specifically the Western countries, the capitalist countries, was now ready to come and invest here. Now, investing here in those countries, this involved openness to the foreign investment, financial opening up, and the currency convertibility. Now, this was the main idea behind this, that FDIs need to come in those, the collapsed country, disintegrated country, and to revive the economy of those countries. And the last point, breakup of existing trade alliance. Earlier, when there was a Soviet Russia and the allies of the Soviet Russia, they used to have the trade with only their allies which were there. Now, under the shock therapy, it was told to them that, look, now you need to have a trade with even those particular Western capitalist economy, and only then it will be possible to revive your economy. Thus, they were absorbed, all these countries, disintegrated countries, they were absorbed in the Western economic system. Now, this is the shock therapy what we have. The first, under the shock therapy, as I've said, it was designed by the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, and it required, this shock was required for those countries to get their life back, their ideology or their life back, and therefore, the first under the shock therapy which was required was to shift to the capitalist economy. Okay, they give up your old socialism and come to this particular system, that is the capitalist economy, where all the means of production distribution will be controlled by the private owners. No more any assets, land, industries will be controlled by the state. Second, third, FDI was to be the engines of the change. Allow the foreign companies now, Western companies now to enter, let them take the hold of the productive system here in the Russia and other those countries which have breaked from the Soviet Russia. And the breakup of the existing trade alliance. Earlier, they used to have the trade and commerce only with their allies countries, the friend countries. No more. Now you need to be a part of the Western capitalist economy. They were absorbed in the Western economic system. So this is what was the shock therapy, which was applied to the Russia and other countries. Now let us study about the consequences of shock therapy. What were the consequences of this shock therapy, which was applied on this Russia and other disintegrated countries and the allied countries of the Soviet Russia? The first very important thing is the first consequence is the collapse of industrial complexes. Now shock therapy said, okay, everything should be privatized. So there was no other way left for the government of these countries than to sell their industries. So they started selling the industries, and like this 90% of the industries were put up for the sale for the private individuals and the companies. Almost 90% of the industries and all land, everything industries was sold to the private owners by these disintegrated countries from the Soviet Russia. Secondly, and when industries were sold, they were sold to the throwaway prices to a very cheaply they were sold by the government. So there was a total collapse of the industrial complexes. That was the consequence of the shock therapy. Secondly, the value of ruble, that is the Russian currency, declined dramatically because of this. The value of the ruble, that is the Russian currency, declined dramatically. The rate of inflation was so high that the people started losing the savings also what they were having. The collective farm system disintegrated, and people were having shortage of food. And throughout Russia started to import food. Food also they need to import from the outside. So that was the second consequence of the consequence of the shock therapy. Third, social welfare schemes were destroyed. Now in the past we have studied since the emerging of the Soviet Russia from 1917 onwards, we saw that everything, all the means of production, distribution, everything was being controlled by the state. And this naturally was a responsibility of the state to give all the basic things to the people of the Soviet Russia. That was the education, healthcare, and the social welfare scheme. Everything was given by the state. But with the coming of the capitalism, with the coming of the shock therapy, which was brought in here now, there was a capitalist system. All the means of production, distribution were controlled by the state. So naturally, all the money was in the hands of the private people. And naturally, the state was having a lack of fund now. So the state gave up the ideas of the social welfare scheme, was completely destroyed in the Soviet Russia. Fourth, the construction of the democratic institution was not given priority. Now, dear friends, when we talk about the changing of the shock therapy, in hurry, everything, they took up only one particular aspect. Because when we talk of the capitalism, along with the capitalism, democratization also need to come in. Now, what has happened in this particular countries, Russia and other disintegrated countries and the allies groups which were there of the Soviet Russia earlier, they only thought of getting one part of it. Only towards the economic institution. More stress was given on the economic institution. All the privatization of the state assets was done. And along with that, they need to actually, if the capitalist system has to flourish, then there should be simultaneously, the political system should be a democratic system, where the much attention was not given. Both of them, they need to go together. That is, capitalism and the democracy will go hand in hand. But here, only more attention was given towards the economic structure, but the construction of the democratic institution was not given priority. The Russia and the other countries, they drafted their constitution in hurry. They formed what is the system with more power was given to the president. The executive power vested in the hands of the president, and he was made more powerful than the elected representative in the Russia and elsewhere. So naturally, the consequence of the shock therapy tells us that though the shock therapy was applied along with that, what was required, the need of the hour was then having a democratic institution, where the construction of the democratic institution was not given much of the importance and the priority, and naturally, therefore, its total system itself failed. And the last point here is the largest garage sale. That is, the industries were sold to the throwaway prices. Most citizens sold their vouchers. The citizens was given the vouchers to come and buy this particular industries. The many of the citizens who got the vouchers, because they were not having enough money, started selling these vouchers in the black market because they needed money then. So these are the consequences of the shock therapy. The first very important thing what you need to understand here is, because of the shock therapy which was applied, first thing what happened, collapse of the industrial complexes. Almost 90% of the industries were sold to the private individuals. Value of the ruble declined dramatically. There was an inflation, there was shortage of the food grains and the consumer goods. Social welfare scheme was completely given by the state. Construction of the democratic institution was not given the priority. As I've said, when you talk of the one particular reform, that is the economic reform, you need to also simultaneously go along with the capitalism. You need to go with the democratic institutions also, need to be established firmly. And the last was the garage sale, that this particular industries were sold to the throwaway prices, and the people were given the vouchers to come and buy these industries. The people, because there was a lack of money, they started selling these vouchers in the black market. So this was the consequences of the shock therapy. So dear student, we have almost completed that is the end of bipolarity, this second particular chapter in your syllabus, as I've said, which has around about 5 marks. And then I have just said the first, we'll just like to go back and revise actually what we have done till the end. What we have done today was just revising the things, the Cold War. Now this is the very first lesson of the Cold War, which have round about the 5 marks again. And in the Cold War, what you may have studied about was the important questions which you have studied in the Cold War was, what is Cold War? Then you have studied about the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is one of the basic event of this particular Cold War. You have studied then why superpower was in the need of the alliance building. You have also studied why the smaller state need to be a part of the alliances. And then you have studied, of course, the new international economic order, that is the LDCs. Now this very first topic is having the 5 marks, and the end of bipolarity is also having the 5 marks. Now this end of bipolarity, mostly in section D, question number 25 often comes on this particular chapter, that is end of bipolarity. Now if you go through that, what we have started with the Soviet system here. However, on this Soviet system, there is no possibility the question comes, but real questions are coming from here. These 4 questions which are there, they are like the Jan of this particular chapter. That is, the first is the causes responsible for the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. And as I've said, there are some very causes responsible for the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. I have covered up here. You can see on the screen here. However, when you read your textbook or do some other references also, what happens that you come across some other points also maybe for the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. Please do go to your concerned teacher, ask them, call them and ask them whether they can include these particular causes. However, if it is irrelevant, your teacher will say yes, and even during the time of the correction, an equal importance will be given to any other points if you write there, which is a related points. The second question what we have learned here is the consequences of the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. While studying the consequences of disintegration, we have studied that what I will do is that these main questions which are there, once I'll just go through that very soon, only the main highlights of this particular question. The first what you have to study is the causes responsible for the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. In that, what we have covered was the internal weaknesses of the Soviet political and the economic institution. Second, we said the development of the settler state. The more money was used by the Soviet Russia only for the satellite state, for their development, for the nuclear development of this particular country. Then we have said the Communist Party not accountable for the people. They were not responsible to the people. Then we have said the bureaucrats gained more privilege day by day. The bureaucracy there started becoming more corrupt, more privileges was enjoyed by the bureaucrats in the Soviet Russia, which belonged to the Communist Party of the Soviet Russia. The citizen, then we have studied the citizen became aware of development of the West. The people of Russia started looking at America, the capitalist system, and how far they have developed, and the progress and the freedom what the people were enjoying in the America. So naturally that's comparison. Yes, people was feeling in Soviet Russia that that system is far better. And the last we have seen that Gorbachev, who was responsible for the disintegration of the Soviet Russia, because he was much more attracted towards this particular ideology of capitalism and democracy of the America, and he tried to bring all those particular reforms, economic and the political reform he started in the Soviet Russia. So he was also the main person who was responsible for the disintegration of the Soviet Russia. And then certainly we have seen the consequences of disintegration of the Soviet Russia, and in the consequences of disintegration, what we have seen was the end of the Cold War confrontation. I said there was an ideological difference for which there was a Cold War which was going on between these two. With the collapse of the Soviet Russia, after the Soviet Russia was disbanded or disintegrated, no more that Cold War remained between these two, and there was an end to the Cold War. The mad race for the armaments which had started between these two also came to an end. Then we have seen the emergence of the new countries with the breakout, disintegration of the Soviet Russia. Number of countries emerged out of which. Then we have also studied the emergence of the new players. Earlier, as I've said, there was only two main players in the world politics. One was the USA with its own ideology of capitalism and democracy, and other was the USSR with its ideology of socialism and communism. So naturally, these were the two main players. The whole politics was revolving, the world politics was revolving around these two powers, two power blocks. However, after the collapse of the Soviet Russia, there emerged a number of other players with their separate identity, with their own aspirations. And of course, after the disintegration of the Soviet Russia, the Russia or the countries which broke out. So after the collapse of the Soviet Russia, there was now the countries which were without any ideologies, lifeless. There was a need to get back the life to these countries, and therefore the World Bank and International Monetary Fund came up with what is called as the shock therapy. And the main thing of this shock therapy was the shift to the capitalist economy. No more all the means of production and distribution will be controlled by the state, but it will be controlled by the private owners or the private individuals. Then the privatization of the state as land and industries, everything was sold to the private owners. And FDIs was the engines of change. The communist countries never allowed the other countries, the different ideology, capitalist ideology, they don't allow to come and settled in their area and to start the business. But here, the FDIs was to be a major engines of change. They were need to open the doors for the foreign investor, the Western investor, by which the Western countries decided to come and started investing. So currency convertibility was possible. Next was the breakup of the existing trade alliances. Earlier, as I've said, there was only the trade was going on between the friend countries, allied countries, and the communist countries. Now, these countries were no more supposed to do business only with those previous, their friend countries, but they was now joined, or they were asked to have a trade and commerce also with those Western countries. So they were absorbed in the Western economy. So that was the main thing about the shock therapy which was applied here. Then we have just gone through what is called as the consequences of the shock therapy. And while studying the shock therapy, we have studied the collapse of industrial complexes. The consequence of the shock therapy was that all the industries, all the land, everything was directly sold. 90% of the industries were sold to the private individuals. The value of ruble declined dramatically. We have seen the inflation was at its height. There was a shortage of the consumer goods because of this shock therapy which was applied. The social welfare scheme which was earlier, we have seen the Soviet Russia was providing all the basic necessities to the people. All sort of care was taken by the state itself. I mean the education, health care, and the child care, everything was taken by the state. However, after the shock therapy which was applied, when shock therapy was applied naturally, all the welfare scheme, everything was systematically destroyed. No more any welfare activities were there. Construction of the democratic institution was not given priority. As I've said, when we talk of the capitalism as an economic system, it need to followed by the democratization. However, here only the more stress was given on the economic institution, to change the nature, economic nature of the states. However, along with that, the democratic institution, to set up the democratic institution, priorities was not given. And the constitution of these countries was framed in hurry, by which they brought in what is called as a strong executive president. The elected representatives was not enjoying much of the power. And last, all the industries which were there, they were sold to the throwaway prices. This was one of the greatest garage sale in the history of the world politics. Dear student, this is the end of what we were supposed to do today in the end of bipolarity. Once again, you will have immediately now when you come back to the institution, maybe we are not very sure what is going to happen. If you happen to come back in the institution soon after this pandemic, then you may have what is called as the first formative exam, which is having around about 20 marks. And when you have that, this 2 lessons, altogether 6 lessons you have for the first formative, 4 more to come on your way. For the final exam, board exam, this particular topic, end of bipolarity, has around about 5 marks, often one question, that is a multiple choice type of a question, which comes in section A, question number 1. And other question on this particular chapter comes in section D, this is question number 25. Another thing very important, for this 4 question, question number 25, you will have a choice there. There is or. That means out of this 4 questions which I have stressed on, that is, one is the causes of disintegration, second is consequence of disintegration, third shock therapy, and the fourth is the consequence of shock therapy. Out of this 4 questions, often 2 questions you happen to see in your board exam where you have an option, one you need to answer. That's all for today's lecture. That's the end of bipolarity. And please see that you study it very thoroughly. There's only few questions in this, and you have 5 marks for this particular chapter. Thank you very much.